everybody. Welcome to Represent Jesus Well, an RCC podcast all about what it looks like to look into and discuss different types of people that are learning to endure and live and lead in a way that really represents Jesus well. Today, I get the great pleasure of having Ike Miller on the podcast. Ike is the pastor at Bright City Church in Durham, North Carolina, not to be confused with the Bright City to the south with the other Nick Conley was on here a while back, but super glad you're with me. You're married to Sharon, who we've actually had speak here about a year and a half ago. And then also you are the author of a book called Good Baggage. It's here in my hands. It's awesome.
Nice.
You got a page marked, got all kinds of highlights and stuff in here. It's all good stuff. But thank you so much for being on here with me, man.
Yeah, man. Sam, thanks so much for having me, man. I've been looking forward to our conversation, and I'm always curious to hear like what you found, like what you highlighted. That's always what I'm curious to hear,
we'll get to it.
Insight into people,
Yeah, totally. There's a lot. There's so much stuff. We're going to get into it. But first I want to I want to connect with you on a couple of things, because there's a couple of things that we have in common that are fun, that are like partially related to the book. But the first one is you grew up on a farm.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about that. I grew up on we started out until I was 6. We had dairy cows.
Okay.
Then we traded the smell of dairy cows for the smell of strawberries, which was a win.
That is a win. That is a step up.
Yeah, we switched. But I grew up on a strawberry farm. Now it's a winery and vineyard that my brother runs, but it's a whole different thing. But that's kind of a big part of my story and my formation as I look back. But I'm curious about you.
Yeah. So we had beef cattle. So I was on the other side of things. Yeah. So
for sure.
It wasn't kind of our livelihood. My dad worked for the Department of Agriculture here in North Carolina and ran the fair, and so I love to refer to how I have special access to the fairgrounds at the fair time, which is super awesome.
Totally.
But we had beef cattle, and then we had every kind of animal on our kind of farm at the house, from sheep and goats, horses, donkeys. We had a couple of emus at one point. Like,
no way.
We had it all. It's crazy.
So
that's
awesome.
And then we had a big garden that we, made all kinds of stuff and grew all kinds of stuff in. And so I don't know about you, but my favorite thing now is to just drop random farm knowledge on Sharon.
Absolutely.
Out of the blue.
I'm sometimes out of the blue, but it's really fun when you can be like, well, I know about this because
like we'll drive down a road, and on the side of the road there's like cattle. I'm like, that's a Simmental cow over there, or that's a Jersey cow. She's like, what?
Like, that's hilarious. Or I'll quiz my boys, like as they're driving down the road, like what kind of crop is that, or what kind of thing is this? Nice. And like if they get it wrong, there's a lot of shame endured in that moment.
Right. That's awesome.
So that's one thing that's in common. The other thing is actually wrestling. So you wrestled, and I know that sounds like weird, but like growing up, that wasn't the popular sport. Was it the popular sport for you guys?
Honestly, I don't even know how I got into it. I mean, I know how I got into it. I started when I was a freshman in high school, and so a lot of guys. I don't know when you started, but a lot of guys started like super young.
Totally.
And so I felt like I was behind, but. I think there were several guys on my soccer team that wrestled, and I just kind of got roped into it, and I never looked back. So
you
I loved
liked
it,
it,
man. I did.
Okay. Did you have a little bit of success?
I did. I mean, I never made it to states, but I was near the top of my region, and all that stuff. I was captain of our team, so
that's awesome.
All of that kind of stuff, but never one of the the state championship kind of level. So how about you?
Yeah, so I like to say that I made it to state last senior year, but I had it's kind of like there's an asterisk next to it because I made it there, but I was like third place in sectionals, and so I just got in, like barely got in, and then my first match, if I won, I continued to wrestle. If I lost, I was done, and I lost in overtime, and I know, so close. Was winning the match, and my favorite move was the fireman's, but last second he figured that out, and I couldn't score in the end. Yeah. But the fun fact about that is he went on to get pummeled the rest of the time. Like the next 3 matches he had, I get to say that I lost at state in overtime, which is amazing. Anyways, that's my story, my claim to fame.
No, that's awesome.
Okay, enough about those things. I want to ask just to start off with about the book. So it's such an interesting book because even before it came out, I was talking with different people in my office and just knew that they were going to write this. And I was saying like, hey, there's this book. You should pre-order it because, man, it's such a perfect fit for what we're talking about right now, which is really cool. But I want to ask, like, just straight off the bat, why'd you write the book?
Yeah.
Like, if you were to give for the listener, like, what's the like impetus there for you to write this book called Good Baggage?
You know, the short version would be kind of growing up in the context I did with a parent with an alcohol use disorder and my parents then divorcing. I went on kind of a journey where I really loved talking about relationships. I mean, when I was in college, I was kind of the person that friends went to for advice on relationships. And so the funny thing about that is I kind of thought, well, you know, I know what I went through as a kid, but I am obviously like past that now because I give advice on relationships, you know, how naive I was. But then kind of getting married myself and realizing I had not escaped that there were things that I had carried into my marriage, that I carried into my friendships, into how I approached work, how I approached even my professors in school, realizing that I had not escaped that and had started learning a little bit about kind of the impact of having a parent with alcoholism. But really it was during the pandemic in particular, where leading in a season when you're making decisions that impact everybody. And at the end of the day, you're going to make a decision that somebody's not going to like, somebody's going to be upset with you. And just kind of having the impact of my childhood coming to the surface in how I responded to that and realizing just how deeply I felt like it was my responsibility to fix everyone's feelings. And that's just one example, but realizing I've got to do something about this. I've got to work on this or else I'm going to end up burned out in ministry, or worse, I'm going to have some sort of moral failing because it's an escape from my anxiety and my stress. And so I kind of started doing some of that work and kind of identifying, here are some of the ways that my childhood had impacted how I lead and lead in ministry. But then I kind of took a step from there and realized, yes, there were things that were bad from my childhood that were making it difficult to lead. But at some point I began to realize, actually, there's also some things that I think prepared me for leadership if I can learn how to leverage them, if I can learn how to use them. And I started to explore more and more of those and realized, gosh, I think that there's something here that needs to be talked about, because I think we just assume, well, I went through this as a child, and so this is the way it has hurt me in my relationships as an adult. But what if there's some things that our childhoods put in us that actually prepared us for healthy relationships? And so that was kind of like, okay, let's run with this. I think there's something to say here.
That's awesome. So one of the next things I've written down in my like notes as I'm preparing to think about talking about this with you is this word superpowers, right? Like there are different things that you mention in your book that are these, like you've actually gotten yourself to a place where you realize everything that has come, every bit of baggage, because that normally has a bad connotation. Right. I love how you talk about that. Yeah. It actually has this double-edged sword to it, where there are, yes, some evil, hard, difficult parts to them, but there are also these really incredible things. So I really love how you talk about that. But also, like, I want you to just maybe the piece I want to get into a little bit more here is you talk about dysfunction, right? Like, so you're a child of some dysfunction in your family. How has that, like, what are a couple of specific ways that's really played out in your leadership and maybe family life too? Those are a couple of specific ones, but go ahead.
No, that's great. So when we talk about baggage, first of all, usually what we're talking about are coping mechanisms that we developed in one relationship that was dysfunctional, that we then carry into a relationship that doesn't need it. So we develop a coping mechanism in a childhood relationship. For example, one of those for me was I internalized the problems of sort of my family of origin and assumed that the answer to all of the problems around me was for me to do something better myself, for me to fix something about myself, to improve myself. And so that means now as an adult, when I go into a relationship, if something's wrong with the relationship, my default is to assume I must be doing something wrong. I need to do something. And so that both leads me to take responsibility for things that aren't mine, but it also makes me really defensive if I don't want to take responsibility for it. And so that's one of those things that I needed it in my childhood relationships because it gave me a sense of control over my environment. If things are not okay, but the solution is in me, then I have at least an image of control. And I carry that into other relationships with people who aren't as dysfunctional, aren't as chaotic, do not need me to fix them, do not need me to fix their problems. And yet I try to, right? And so that negatively affects our relationship. Another one is in my environment.
Can I ask you a quick question about that one? Sorry. So that's the side of the sword that's uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Like there's the ugly side there.
Yeah.
How does that one play out where, man, there's some good stuff here? Mm-hmm. I'm curious because go ahead.
Yeah. So when it comes to the internalizing, the way that where that language comes from is when it comes to responding to our pain, just as humans, we typically respond one of two ways. We either internalize, meaning we assume that we're responsible, and if we can fix something about ourselves, then we'll fix the problem, or we externalize. We assume that the problem is everybody else's, and if they would get their junk together, then I would be okay, right? Yep. And so for the good in that is you're extremely responsible. You are not somebody who just waits for everybody else to fix it. You are someone who jumps to take responsibility for things. If there's something wrong with the relationship, you have this internal drive to see that relationship reconciled and healed. And so there is this internal drive in you that comes from internalizing that when used well can be really a gift to the relationship.
That's awesome. And you had another example. Didn't mean to cut you off, but go ahead.
No, you're good.
Piece.
So another one is, and this is particularly in the environment of someone who was an alcoholic, or maybe there was some kind of abuse or just emotional unhealth. But in the environment that I grew up in, one of your coping mechanisms, or my coping mechanisms, was that I felt like my job was to control the emotions and reactions of my father. That my responsibility was to make sure he was happy so that I was safe.
Yeah.
And what that meant was whenever I walked into a room that my dad was in, I was constantly reading the emotional climate of the room. I was trying to get a sense for where is he emotionally? Is he happy? Is he sad? Is he angry? Is he disappointed? Is it safe to be here? Do I need to get out of here? What do I need to do? And so the gift of that is that it gave me an incredible ability to read people, to read body language, to read facial expressions, to read tone, such that now I can walk into a room and I can discern, okay, what's the emotional climate of this room? Where are people at? Is it going to be detrimental for me just to dive into business in this meeting when we really need to address some other stuff first? Or I come home, I can read Sharon's body language and her emotion and know, like, now is not the time to launch into something that I need. We need to talk about whatever is going on with her. And so it gives you this incredible ability to read people now in our relationships.
Is that ever a crutch?
Oh, man. Yes.
I just know it from personal experience, that one.
So that was one that actually was kind of a wake-up call for me. Is I had this experience consistently where on Sunday mornings I would go into church and I would look at people's faces, and if they had this like downcast look on their face, or they look upset or frustrated, I just assumed I must have done something. Like it's my fault. I must have done something. And one time I was talking with my counselor about this, and she just goes, "Ike, no offense, you're just not that important."
That's a great thing to hear.
It was exactly what I needed to hear. And so realizing, okay, I can take this too far. This whole like mind reading thing, I can take it too far.
That's so interesting. So as you're thinking about all these different pieces, one of the things that's come to my mind is, so I grew up with what I would say is a really healthy family life. Like it's a big blessing to my life. I'm grateful for it. However, there's so much as I'm reading through this book that I don't just think of how I can help others. I actually very much identify with a lot of it myself. And so as I think about this, there's this almost spectrum of dysfunction that people deal with, because however healthy your family life is, there's still dysfunction no matter
Nobody's
what.
perfect. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, as you've thought through this and talked with people about this, whether they've come from a really difficult family life or not, have you heard that same thought? And then how do you, first let's start there, and then I've got to follow up.
Yeah, I mean, people have been all over the spectrum of, extreme dysfunction, abuse, chaos. Both parents were addicted to some substance, to things where they can't look back and point to like, here's a moment of trauma, but it was clear there was emotional unhealth in our family. And so one of the things that was really helpful as I was preparing to write this book is a psychologist wrote a book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents.
Ooh, yeah.
And so these are parents that weren't overtly, abusive or dismissive, but there was just emotional unhealth, maybe some enmeshment going on where a parent could not understand their own identity apart from their child, or a parent who was a workaholic, right? So they weren't abusive, but they were distant. They were emotionally unavailable. And how all of those things, though maybe not destructive, have an impact on how we enter relationships now. And so that's been a big part of kind of conversation since the book came out, is just helping people understand that, yeah, this is a lot about like our childhood relationships, but the reality is any relationship where we've experienced dishonesty or a lack of transparency, maybe there was broken trust, maybe there was betrayal, maybe there was abandonment of some point. It doesn't matter when it happened, it's affected us. And so we carry that into other relationships.
Yeah, it's really, really good. We're just finishing up a series right now, just as we're recording. So we have one more Sunday left of how to get the change you're looking for. It's a nice, catchy title to talk about like what actual change should look like.
Yeah.
But one of the titles was all about like the past experiences that have formed you, and how some of those things can be really formative for us. And there's this touchy line with that, because some things are just evil.
Yeah.
And when you try to redeem them, it doesn't make that thing that happened any less evil. So my question for you is, as you think about your dad, as I read through this, it was a big, powerful thing. How has writing this book and wrestling with this topic changed how you see him, or formed how you think about that relationship?
So my father passed away in 2007 due to alcohol-related, issues. And so I've had a lot of time to kind of process our relationship. And, before he passed, a couple of years before that, I had really kind of reached out first with a letter. I mean, we were in conversation. He would come visit me in college, those kinds of things, but wrote him a letter just kind of laying out a lot of how I felt about things. And whether he responded a certain way or gave a certain response, I just needed to communicate those things. And essentially his response was, that he appreciated the letter, but there were also two sides to every story kind of thing. And, that was disappointing to some degree, but it was also, okay, at least I know where we stand, and I won't wish I had said something that I didn't say. And so since then, I think with my dad, I've both come to understand more clearly the nature of our relationship. I think for a long time, I was resistant to acknowledging that he was ever physically abusive, but only in the last couple of years, really being honest with myself that was true. But also realizing that forgiveness, for example, doesn't mean that I just pretend like that never happened. But that it's more along the lines of not allowing what he did to continue to affect how I feel about him, and being able to move beyond that, so that I can tell some of these stories, not from a place of like, I'm still angry or still upset or lacking forgiveness, but from a place of, I've processed this. This is the impact that it had on me. And now I'm ready to move to a place of, how do I experience healing?
Yeah, man, it's a lot to process, but also it's a really, um, because there's always this tension of you don't ever want to lose the reality of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You never want that to go away because that almost stops being true, and you want to live in reality.
Yeah.
But then to have something that, I mean, in a way, as I read the book, it seemed like this has formed you in so many ways that now I'm guessing like you're happy to be who you are,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
you can't take parts of that story out.
Yeah, a big part of that was I kind of had to be brought to the end of who I thought I was supposed to be, or how I thought I was supposed to be as a pastor, as a husband, as a father, um, and realizing that was very much sort of a shell, an image that I felt like I needed to maintain, but that was exhausting to do so, that it was isolating, that it was actually driving me myself to self-medicate in some ways. And at the end of the day, it was better for me to be genuine and authentic about who I am and not be who I thought everybody wanted me to be, but to find contentment in who I am. And in that, I think it's one of those things where this book never would have been written if I hadn't just been willing to embrace that and say, okay, obviously what I went through was not okay. It was not good. It was, like you said, there was evil in that. But that doesn't mean I can't use what I've learned, both for my own relationships and help others as they pursue healing.
Yeah, you said something that reminded me of a part of the book that I awkwardly identify with, but think it's really a thing that people struggle with, because you talk about being genuine. Like, this is who I am. I'm not going to try and hide it. I'm not gonna, whatever. But you talk about the time that your friends came over to take you to a rodeo, and identify with this because growing up, I was a farm kid.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to be lumped in with all the farm kids because that wasn't me. And now, like, I look back and I'm proud of that fact, and I think that's beautiful and good. But it's a huge formative thing for me. But can you tell a little bit about that moment? But then also just because I think I literally had this moment of, I feel so seen in that moment, because I want to like match what people are expecting of me, but then I don't know. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and talk about that a bit more.
Yeah. So essentially the story is I grew up on a farm, but I went to school close enough to Chapel Hill, which is a more kind of suburban area. UNC Chapel Hill is there, all of that. And so a lot of my friends were not farm people, and so who I was during the week was kind of this preppy soccer playing kid, and who I was on the weekend was this kind of farm boy, cowboy boots kind of kid. And so I just kind of who I thought I needed to be in different environments, whether that was for approval and acceptance or just because I wanted to meet people's expectations of me. And so the funny story is that one of my friends who was from Chapel Hill invited me to a rodeo. And this was just like this moment of identity crisis. Like, okay, here's this rodeo that most people would wear, cowboy boots and a belt buckle and Wrangler jeans to, but I'm going with my like soccer playing preppy friend. So what do I do? Who am I supposed to be? Who are they wanting me to be? And so I decided to do what I thought was playing it safe, which is dressing how I thought my friend would dress so that at least, we would be on the same page. And he shows up to the door to pick me up, and there he is in Wrangler jeans and cowboy boots. And I'm wearing like Reebok pumps. And
that's like, it's so great.
So embarrassing.
But it's such a true, like that story just perfectly epitomizes what I feel like half of us are doing every single day.
That's right.
Like, which person am I supposed to be now?
Yes.
And like, I know that you bring in the fact that was what you grew up with, right? Like, you grew up thinking like, I got to figure out who am I supposed to be in this moment at which time. And I feel like a lot of us identify with that. How have you, I mean, you talk a little bit about this in the book, a lot about this, but how have you been able to come to terms with who Ike is now?
Yeah. So one of the things, and I'm not sure if I talk about this in the book, but I think one of the things was realizing just how exhausting that is to always be trying to figure out, who am I supposed to be in this moment? And so some of it was just me reaching a point of just sheer exhaustion. But the other part was realizing that the best thing I could offer people was not a performance of who they wanted me to be, but to simply be present to them. Because at the end of the day, I think we tend to go into conversations and relationships more focused on ourselves than we are the person that we're supposed to be present to. But that's what makes somebody feel heard. That's what makes somebody feel seen. And so as a pastor in particular, I kind of decided, okay, I'm going to let go of the performance as much as I can. I'm going to just do my best to show up, to not worry about what I'm saying, but to more focus on asking good questions and to be present to people. So some of it was just like, okay, whenever I begin to feel that like exhaustion from performing, that should be an indication to me that I'm trying to keep something up that I need to let go of, So that's been a big one.
That's a really good word for it, performing. I mean, that really is a big picture of what it is, because I think that there's a sense of which, and you can kind of tell when a person, when they switch, they make that shift, and they're actually more present, or they're really there. That's really
less
good.
Anxious. There's less of a need to fill every gap with a word of some sort, and to just be present with one another is powerful. Yeah.
So there's a few more things. There's so much I want to talk to you about, but I'll hit on a couple more. One of the things is manipulation. Talked a lot about manipulation in the book, so I'm kind of hop skipping all over the place. I hope you don't mind that. So manipulation is one of those things where it comes across in different ways, and you had this really good example of it in the book, where it's almost like it's more than just forcing someone, but it's like a love description. I think that's how you described it. Like, if you love me, you would, is the kind of comment that is being made. And this really goes into your comment about how this isn't just for people this is for people that had maybe emotionally immature parents, right? So that there's a manipulative thing that happens. I mean, I feel like this opens up the book to so many people, because I think that's a really common thing for people to experience. Can you just talk a little bit about what that looks like, and how you understood it, and how you can break that, I guess, just solve all of our problems. So
manipulation is one of those things that I think we experience more often than we realize. And it's also something that we do to others more often than we realize, whether that is through simply like emotional manipulation and I think we do that from a place of, genuine concern. There's something that we want to see happen, and so we make a big deal about it, for example, and we're not intending to be manipulative, but the consequence of that is someone feels like, well, normally I wouldn't do this, but because you're so insistent and about this, I'll do it. And so it's not like malintent, but it just happens. It happens in so many ways, and some of that is just persuasion. But the more kind of painful ways that it's used, the more problematic ways that it's used, are in relationships where we are already giving so much in the relationship. We're already bending over backwards to accommodate and to care for them. And then in the one moment where we ask for something in return, the response is, how could you ask me for that? Like, how dare you ask me for that? And there's this subtle, like, it kind of keeps you in this place of subservience, because you're being manipulated by the fear of being seen as, demanding, or asking for too much, or asking for something unfairly. When you step back from that, you're like, I do this for you every day. The fact that I asked you to do one thing, but we get so sucked into a dysfunctional relationship that we can't see it. And I think one of the places I talk about loyalty, for example, in one chapter, and I talk about the story of Samson and Delilah, and how, he tells her, that if they tie him with fresh bowstrings, that will take away his power. And they come in and they try to tie him up, and he breaks free. And she's like, how dare you like lie to me, and she does that over and over again. And the whole time you're reading the story and you're like, Samson, dude,
Yeah,
she's doing
right?
this to you
She's
over and
gonna
over again. But she's
exactly.
manipulating him, by saying like, if you loved me, you would tell me. And it's like, dude, can you not see the bigger picture? And so manipulation is one of those things that's so hard for us to see as well.
Yeah. So as you're thinking about that, I mean, I think it's so easy to be caught in it and not realize you're caught in it. So because of that, what are some of those indicators? I mean, that's just the thing. I mean, you spelled a number of that in the book, so it's helpful. Like even like I think it was triangulation and that sort of a thing. Like that, those are really good indicators. But I'm curious if there's something like if there's like one. If this is happening, if you're feeling uncomfortable or like fear, maybe that's what it would be. I don't know, that you're finding yourself in that spot.
The biggest indication, one of the things that I've found really helpful is in those moments where, one, you're fearful to ask for something in a relationship, but then you realize I'm fearful and yet they don't hesitate to ask me for things.
Yeah.
Is an indication that the relationship is not what I call in the Bible, the book, reciprocal, meaning I do something for them and then they do something for me, and then I do something for them and then they do something for me. Now, it doesn't always have to be tit for tat kind of thing, but there needs to be reciprocity. It shouldn't be scary to ask them to do something for you when you are always doing something for them. And so if you find yourself in that feeling, that's an indication that the relationship is unbalanced and probably some manipulation.
That's really helpful. That's really good. So sorry, there's a couple things.
Go for it, man. I'm all game, man.
There's one part you said you hate awkward moments. I just want to say thanks for saying it, because I'm with you on that. I'm the one in the group filling the gap.
Yes.
And I'm working really hard on being like quiet. It's a really good thing. But I think that's just funny because I think that there is this moment of like you want to control the situation, and if there's quiet, you've lost control potentially.
And you've lost control. And also I feel this most intensely in pastoral situations where I want you to have a good experience, And so that's where I am the worst about it, is like, I want to control your experience of this time or this place. And so if it's awkward, that means you're having a bad experience.
Which for most people, like, they don't mind the quiet. It's fine.
Right.
But
yeah.
It's so real. But with that, another piece to this is you had one line. I wrote it down, and it's bouncing out from something from earlier. But you said, "What many think is our limp is actually our life purpose." And so, as you're thinking about this, I mean, what I love about this good baggage theme is so often we let those things define us in the most negative way, and it's awful. It really hurts. It's something that we hang on to and point back to as why things maybe suck in life, right? But you're saying that there's some purpose there. So I'm curious, for you, do you feel like even in your role as a pastor, you found your purpose and it's really deeply connected to that limp?
Yeah. I want to be clear when we talk about this, that we're also not saying that those things happened so that I would have this purpose for my life. And being able to say that clearly, because, we did this sermon series with our church, kind of going through the book. And one of those messages was, not everything happens for a reason, because it can kind of narrate things. And I don't know what your theology of, providence is and all that, but it really can feel like a sham notion of redemption to say, like, I'm going to push you off the boat, but then I'm going to save you. And then I get to be the hero. You're like, that doesn't feel like authentic redemption, So all that to say, what I think has happened in that journey, though, is coming to understand that although God did not desire those things, he is not the author of the things that I experienced. He can still take those things and bring good things out of them. However, what's important is to understand those things are not things that make me strong. They are actually things that make me weak. They're things that our world would see as insufficiencies or inadequacies or drawbacks. And I think when we see our pain, we see what we've been through, through the lens of what Paul says of your power is made perfect in my weakness, we begin to see, oh, God isn't glorified through my strength. He's glorified when in my weakness, he still uses that for his kingdom. And so that's kind of where we get to leverage those limps, those places that we would see as insufficiencies, as inadequacies, and say, God, I'm going to offer this up for you to use. And so the way that I've seen that play out in ministry is I'm pretty transparent in my preaching, not in the sense that I overshare, but I'm open about the fact that my father was an alcoholic. I share very openly that Sharon and I go to counseling and that we have for 14 years since the beginning of our marriage. And all of that is because I want us to be a community where people come and show up because they know here's a place where I can go to for healing, not a place I go to put on an image, to put up, a front like I've got it all together. The church is supposed to be more like a hospital than a country club, I think. And so we see that happen by modeling that as leaders.
Yeah, that's really, really true. It's really good. Actually, it leads me into what can be kind of our final topic for questions. Unless you have anything, I'm game.
Yeah. No.
But you talk near the end about sanctification, which is a really churchy word, but you define it as healing. Mm-hmm. And healing by way of what Jesus does inside of us through our life. Yeah. And our mission statement as a church is to represent Jesus well in Ripon and beyond. Mm-hmm. That's the shortened version of it. But the idea is that we're supposed to imitate Jesus in everything that we do. But that means that we need to be formed by him on the inside. We can't fake it. We can, but it doesn't last long.
Right. Exactly.
So as you're talking about sanctification and through this idea of good baggage, I'm just curious, how has that helped you become a person that does your best to represent Jesus well? And what does that look like through those terms?
Yeah. When we think of, this term of sanctification, the language that I use is sanctification is the process by which we are conformed to the image and character of Christ. And so in that process, we typically think of it as I become less sinful. Like that's how it's like translated for most people, is I sin less than I used to. And that part may be true, but the bigger thing that I want to communicate, and I try to communicate in the book, is that for Jesus to come, he is not only putting on display for us who God is, but as the God-man who is both human and divine, he is also showing us who we were created to be as humans, what kind of human we were created to be. And so our sanctification is the process of becoming the kind of human that Jesus was. And so what I want to make the case for in the book is that includes not just our forgiveness and our becoming more righteous. It's also the healing of our wounds, the healing of our brokenness. Because for a lot of us, when we don't experience healing from the pain of relationships, we go into other relationships and we hurt other people. Yeah. And so it's not so much that we're like willfully sinning against God as it is we're acting out of our brokenness. We don't know any better. This is our default mode of operation. And so sanctification is about becoming more righteous, but it's also about becoming more whole and healed. And so sanctification being that process by which we are healed into the character and image of Christ.
So as you, Pastor Ike Miller at Bright City Church, and you're talking about what that looks like for a typical person, I mean, there's definitely this reality that that's what we want. What does it look like, or what has it looked like for you to rely on Jesus for that? Like what about him has changed the way you view healing?
I think, so speaking for myself, and granted, healing's going to look differently depending on how our pain shows up. But for me, my pain oftentimes showed up in my need to perform, the anxiety I carried about a certain event happening, or something that I was supposed to do a really good job in. And that then led me to be short with my family, to not show up and be present with them because I was preoccupied with something else. I could become so obsessed with the details that I forget about the relationship with my team members, all of those things. And what healing looked like for me was, one, really embracing the fact that God's presence is with us at all times. And what that meant for me was being able to say, okay, regardless of what moment I'm going into, if God is with me, I have everything that I need for this moment. And that just helped relieve me of the pressure that I felt to perform. It reminded me that God cared a lot more about my ministry than I did, and that it was okay to show up as who I am, and that God called me to be the pastor of Bright City, not some idea of who I was supposed to be, or, the, famous pastor who was placed at this campus for this reason. It was God placed me here because he wanted me in all of my strengths and weaknesses to pastor this community. And so it set me free from the image management, and it set me free to show up and to be present with people. Kind of like you were saying, where you go into conversations and you're free from the pressure to create a certain experience, to control the environment. And you actually feel like I'm here with you.
Yeah. It's a whole different experience.
Which is what Jesus did. I mean, that was the impact that Jesus had on people, is people felt seen by Jesus. And so what are the things that are getting in the way of me creating that experience for other people?
Yeah, man, that's really, really good. I feel like we have another hour in us, but I'm gonna call it because I want to respect your time, right? Hey, this has been so good. I know this is the book, right? So it's good baggage. Make sure you pick it up if you haven't. It's just super helpful. But I'm curious if you want to follow you or like listen to you and see what you're doing. Where can they find that?
Yeah, online, IkeMiller.com, or social media, Ike F. Miller. Those would be great places. Yeah.
Well, thank you, man. It's been such a pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
You bet.